History is a river, flowing inexorably forward. But what if the course had shifted? What if Poland, the first to resist the black tide of German aggression in 1939, had not been left to fight alone? What if the great powers that had pledged their support had not hesitated, not remained idle behind their fortified lines, but had instead struck with the full force of their might? If Poland had not fallen in the autumn of that fateful year, if the Allies had acted with resolve rather than reluctance, the Second World War itself might have taken an altogether different shape, perhaps one where the cost was not so unbearably high, where the suffering of nations was not so absolute. When Germany unleashed its blitzkrieg upon Poland on September 1st, 1939, the world watched, stunned by the sheer speed and brutality of the assault. But Poland was not weak, nor was its defeat preordained. Its soldiers, fierce and defiant, stood against a mechanized juggernaut with a courage that would later be immortalized in the annals of history. Yet courage alone was not enough, for Poland had been left isolated, its fate seemingly sealed before the first shot had even been fired. Britain and France had promised to stand by Poland's side, had sworn that an attack on Poland would be an attack on them, but when the moment of truth arrived, their armies remained still, their strength untapped, their declarations empty words upon the wind. Had France acted with decisiveness, had it hurled its forces into the Rhineland as soon as German divisions poured into Poland, the war might have ended before it truly began. The bulk of the German army was in the east, committed to the Polish front, leaving the western frontier weak, barely defended. The Maginot Line, that great fortress of steel and stone, stood as an illusion of strength. But beyond it, the road to the heart of Germany lay open. The Wehrmacht could not have fought on two fronts, not in 1939, not with Poland resisting fiercely in the east. The fall of Berlin might have come, not in 1945, but in 1940, before the Holocaust, before the world was consumed in the fires of total war. And yet it was not only France that failed Poland in its hour of need. Britain too held within its grasp the power to turn the tide. The Royal Air Force, though small, could have launched bombing raids on German supply lines, crippling the Wehrmacht's advance. The Royal Navy, dominant on the seas, could have blockaded German ports, severing the flow of resources that fueled the war machine. Even small actions, even limited strikes could have disrupted the lightning war that sought to crush Poland in weeks. Instead, there was only the phony war, a tragic farce where the Western Allies remained inert, as though war could be waged by declaration alone, as though time itself would break Hitler's will. But Poland was not defeated solely because its allies faltered. The betrayal came from the east as well, from the dagger in the back delivered by the Soviet Union on September 17, 1939. The secret pact between Hitler and Stalin, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, sealed Poland's fate, dividing its land before the struggle had even begun. Had the Soviets remained neutral, had they not colluded in Poland's destruction, the war might have played out very differently. Poland, alone against Germany, could have held its ground far longer, its defenses reinforced, its forces reorganized. The eastern border would not have been another front to defend, but a sanctuary, a line upon which Polish forces could regroup and counterattack. But Stalin, ever the opportunist, saw in Poland not an ally against Germany, but a victim ripe for conquest. Even so, even in the face of betrayal, Poland did not surrender easily. Its resistance was fierce. Its soldiers fought beyond the limits of endurance, from the fields of Wisna, where a handful of men stood against an entire German corps, to the streets of Warsaw, where defenders turned their city into a fortress. And had reinforcements arrived, had Britain and France honored their word, Poland might have held out long enough for a true counter-offensive to materialize. Germany's blitzkrieg relied on speed, on overwhelming force striking before the enemy could react. But what if Poland had not been alone? What if, instead of weeks, the war in Poland had dragged on for months? The longer the battle, the greater the chance for intervention, the greater the likelihood that Germany's momentum would break before it could build. Had Poland survived, the world itself might have been spared the darkest chapters of the war. The Holocaust, the mass executions, the devastation wrought upon Poland's people, perhaps these horrors could have been averted. The Polish government, instead of fleeing into exile, could have continued the fight from its own soil. The Polish army, undestroyed, could have formed the backbone of a greater Eastern Front against Germany. The war might not have spread so swiftly, the occupation not been so absolute. And if Hitler had been forced to fight a prolonged war in Poland, might his ambitions have been checked? Might the great conflagration that consumed Europe have been extinguished before it engulfed the world? And what of the Soviet Union? If Poland had endured, Stalin's designs on Eastern Europe might have been thwarted. The brutal occupation that followed, the mass deportations, the Katyn massacre, perhaps none of these would have come to pass. Poland would not have been bled dry by both occupiers, would not have been left at Yalta to be carved up once more. Instead, it might have emerged as a strong and independent power, a bulwark against both fascism and communism, a force that could shape the post-war world rather than be shaped by it. History, of course, does not bend to what-ifs. The river has flowed, and Poland's fate was written in the suffering of its people, in the ruins of its cities, in the graves of its fallen. But to imagine a world where Poland had not been abandoned, where its allies had stood beside it in more than words, is to see a world where justice prevailed, where tyranny was crushed before it could spread its poison across continents. It is a world where the Polish soldier, so often forced to fight on foreign soil, could have stood upon his own, knowing that his nation was not alone, knowing that his sacrifice would not be in vain. Poland did not lose because it lacked courage. It did not fall because it lacked the will to fight. It was betrayed by those who had sworn to protect it, by those who had the power to turn the tide, but chose instead to wait, to watch, to let the floodwaters rise unchecked. But if they had acted, if the guns of the West had roared in unison with those of Poland, then perhaps, just perhaps, history would have been written in different ink. Dziękuję. Like and subscribe if you think Poland got betrayed and should be repaid today with vast sums of money.